December 15, 1971. A Pakistan International Airlines Boeing 707 flying from Karachi to Urumqi crash lands in Xinjiang, deep in western China. While the crew walked away with only minor injuries, what followed was something strange. Instead of the usual air crash investigators, a team of Chinese engineers quietly descends on the crash site. But they're not here to investigate. Rather, they're here to take the plane apart, piece by piece, and figure out how it was built. Because at this point, China didn't really know how to build a commercial aircraft. And what emerges next shocks the entire world. After just 9 years in 1980, China rolls out the Y-10, its first large passenger jet, built almost entirely from reverse-engineered Boeing wreckage. Anyone who looked at this plane could instantly see how uncannily similar it was to the 707. However, its aerodynamics were so poor, China quietly shelves the entire program. But since, things have changed. In recent years, Beijing has quietly funneled billions of dollars into a single state-backed company called COMAC, with one goal: to take on Boeing and Airbus head-on in the global market. And in a concerning development for both manufacturers, European regulator EASA has already begun test flying COMAC's current flagship, the C919. Meaning there's a real chance that we could see Chinese jets taking over the European skies. But the certification process might actually be the least interesting part of this story. Because what's happening off the radar is what Boeing and Airbus should really be worried about. So, can COMAC really break up the Airbus-Boeing duopoly to become the world's third major plane manufacturer? For decades, China watched from the sidelines as its state-owned airlines funneled hundreds of billions of dollars into the pockets of two foreign manufacturers, Boeing and Airbus. For a country known as the world's factory, that was a striking paradox. Every time a jet lifted off from Beijing, Shanghai, or Shenzhen, the profits flowed into foreign hands rather than a manufacturer of its own. To Beijing, that wasn't a suitable arrangement. So in 2006, when the Chinese Communist Party released its latest 5-year plan, it came with a bold directive. China would build its own commercial aircraft, and it would spare no expense in doing so. The result? The COMAC C919, China's first domestically developed narrow-body jet more than a decade in the making. It's a single-aisle aircraft configured for 168 passengers, placing it squarely in the same category as the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A320. It features a modern glass cockpit, fly-by-wire controls, and the kind of composite materials you'd expect on a 21st century airliner. On paper, it belongs in the same conversation as its Western rivals. And that conversation matters enormously, because the 737 MAX and the A320neo aren't just popular aircraft, they are the backbone of global aviation. These narrow-body jets cover domestic routes, medium-haul international corridors, and everything in between, accounting for more than half of the global passenger aircraft fleet. For decades, Boeing and Airbus have functioned as a duopoly, controlling roughly 90% of the commercial aircraft market. But recently, we've seen exactly how dangerous that concentration of power can be. Boeing's troubles over the past several years have been nothing short of chaos. Safety concerns, manufacturing lapses, and a catastrophic erosion of public trust have severely hampered the company's ability to deliver aircraft at the rate the industry needs. And that became impossible to ignore when a door plug blew out of an Alaska Airlines 737 MAX mid-flight in January 2024. Investigators later found that 4 critical bolts holding that panel in place were simply missing. an almost incomprehensible lapse in quality control at one of Boeing's core production facilities. But the problems don't stop at Boeing. Reliability concerns with Pratt & Whitney's GTF-geared turbofan engine have forced airlines to ground and even dismantle brand-new Airbus jets just to scavenge spare parts, creating a severe aircraft shortage that has rippled across the entire industry. To make matters worse, both manufacturers are already under massive production backlogs. Airlines are desperate to get their hands on new jets, while Boeing and Airbus are struggling just to keep up. If you placed an order for a 737 MAX or an A320neo today, you could realistically be waiting over a decade before taking delivery. And those wait times are only getting longer. That is precisely why Beijing hopes its own model can compete with Western giants. First as the dominant carrier at home, and eventually, one day, taking on the global airspace. To seize that opportunity, the Chinese government is believed to have poured eye-popping sums of money into the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China, known as COMAC, which has been tasked with achieving this goal. According to Scott Kennedy, a Chinese economy expert at the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, the total government investment into COMAC since its founding is estimated at somewhere between $49 billion and $72 billion. That figure alone tells you how seriously Beijing takes this bet. But the C919 is not the only aircraft COMAC is building. There is also the C929, a wide-body jet seating between 250 and 320 passengers, which means it's similar in size and market segment to the Airbus A330 and the Boeing 787, targeting yet another profitable segment dominated by the Western giants. In other words, COMAC isn't just coming for the narrow-body market, it intends to take the Western duopoly head-on. And that development has done something remarkable. It has pushed Boeing and Airbus closer together. You see, for most of their history, these two companies have been fierce rivals. In the initial years, Boeing dismissed Airbus as an overly subsidized upstart. That dismissal became harder to sustain in 1988 when Airbus launched the A320 and began overtaking Boeing in orders. The rivalry eventually escalated into legal warfare, with the United States filing a formal challenge at the World Trade Organization in 2004 over European subsidies to Airbus. The EU responded in kind, accusing Washington of giving Boeing comparable support. What followed was the longest and most expensive trade dispute in WTO history. Over $1 billion in tariffs, counter-tariffs, and decades of litigation. But in 2021, the US and EU agreed to suspend those punitive measures, deciding instead to cooperate against what both sides openly called the common threat of COMAC. So, does COMAC actually have what it takes to pull this off? Well, the answer to that is far more complicated than you might think, and here's why. Even though the C919 has received certification from China's own Civil Aviation Administration, the CAAC, it currently lacks approval from the world's two most consequential aviation regulators, the FAA in the United States and EASA in Europe. This is not a minor procedural hurdle. Most countries around the world require that any aircraft operated by their national carriers be validated by either one of these bodies. And industry sources at non-Chinese lessors and airlines have consistently said they would at least want EASA validation of the C919 before even considering the aircraft. While EASA pilots have begun test flights in Shanghai as part of the formal validation process, full certification is not expected at least until the end of this decade. Until that stamp of approval arrives, the C919's international prospects remain severely limited. But that hasn't stopped Beijing from pursuing a different kind of market, one where political relationships matter more than the regulatory credentials. In recent years, China has dramatically expanded its economic footprint across Asia and Africa, financing large infrastructure projects and extending unconditional loans to developing nations. Bypassing the strict policy conditions typically attached to Western lending institutions like the IMF. In return, China hopes to shape the buying decisions of these countries, expecting them to favor Chinese-made products, including aircraft. Beyond government lending, Chinese investment groups have quietly taken ownership stakes in struggling and startup airlines across these regions, nudging them toward COMAC over its proven Western alternatives. That strategy made international headlines in April 2023, when Transnusa became the first airline outside China to operate COMAC jets, deploying them on routes between Manado and Guangzhou. More recently, Gallop Air of Brunei became the latest carrier to place an order, signing for 15 C919s and 15 ARJ21s. But in both of these cases, the airlines in question were either fully or substantially owned by Chinese entities. If you look closely, one thing you'll realize is that these aren't independent commercial decisions, they're engineered outcomes. Adding to that commercial push, COMAC also offers its aircraft at significantly lower prices than either Boeing or Airbus. And with volume discounts applied, those figures drop even further. On paper, the value proposition looks compelling. And yet, despite all of this, most airlines remain deeply reluctant to buy COMAC jets. So, why is that? You see, China has no meaningful global maintenance, repair, and overhaul network for the C919. There is no reliable international infrastructure for sourcing spare parts, scheduling repairs, or managing unplanned downtime. In an industry that operates on razor-thin margins, that kind of uncertainty is not a minor inconvenience, it is a business-ending risk. A grounded aircraft generates zero revenue, and every day it sits on the tarmac waiting for a part that cannot be sourced represents a loss that the airline, especially the small regional budget airlines, simply cannot afford. Then there is the production rate, which has been extraordinarily slow. Since assembly of the C919 began in 2011, just 32 aircraft have been delivered. That's fewer than 3 jets per year. For context, Boeing and Airbus are each completing more than 1 aircraft every single day. While COMAC has announced plans to accelerate output to 150 aircraft per year by 2030, even if COMAC hits that ambitious goal, which is far from guaranteed, it will still take well into the 2030s to clear the current order backlog. At that pace, airlines are better off ordering Western jets, which carry similar wait times but come with far superior MRO and global support network. So, does that mean COMAC is already destined for failure? Well, here is where the situation tips in COMAC's favor, and to understand that, you have to understand the market China is sitting on. China is already one of the world's 3 largest aviation markets, alongside the United States and India. But right now, it isn't just growing, it is exploding. By 2035, analysts project that over 1 billion Chinese travelers will take to the skies every single year. 1 billion passengers. That's more than the entire population of Europe, all needing aircraft to move them across one of the largest countries on the planet. And by 2042, China is expected to account for 20% of global aircraft demand, translating to more than 8,500 new commercial jets over the next 2 decades. That is an almost incomprehensible number. So rather than allowing Boeing and Airbus to absorb that demand, Beijing is planning to redirect it inward, using its own aviation boom as a structural subsidy for COMAC. The order book makes that intent transparent. COMAC C919 has so far recorded nearly 1,200 orders across 25 customers, almost all of them Chinese state-owned carriers or airlines with significant Chinese ownership. It is a captive market engineered by design. And that gives Comac a structural foundation that regional rivals like Embraer and Bombardier have never had, both of which depend almost entirely on winning sales abroad. But there's a catch. Actually, there are several. And some are not problems Beijing can simply spend its way out of. As I mentioned earlier, Comac's current build rate is so slow that it's already struggling to fulfill its existing order book. Now, China's other industries have proven time and again that the country has a remarkable capacity for scaling up mass production when it sets its mind to it, be it the high-speed rail network or the growth of its automobile sector. But Comac's situation is more complicated, because its production rate does not depend solely on its own capabilities. Despite being marketed as China's homegrown aircraft, only the bare airframe of the C919, the fuselage, and the wings is manufactured by Chinese entities. For everything else, the engines, the avionics, the landing gear, and a long list of other critical systems, Comac remains heavily dependent on Western suppliers like Honeywell, Liebherr, and CFM International. In fact, nearly 70% of the C919 is built by non-Chinese companies. And that is where the problems begin to stack up. You may already be aware of Boeing and Airbus's recent production delays caused by supply chain slowdowns. Since many of those same Western suppliers feed directly into Comac's production line, Comac faces those exact same bottlenecks. And even when supply chain conditions do improve, those Western suppliers will naturally prioritize their long-standing partners, companies that collectively order hundreds of thousands of components per year, pushing Comac further down the queue. But the supplier issue runs deeper than logistics. There is a far more controversial dimension to the C919 story, one that stretches across multiple countries and involves allegations of industrial espionage. Over the course of the C919's development, there have been serious, well-documented allegations of espionage targeting key C919 component suppliers in the United States and elsewhere. Multiple individuals believed to be acting on behalf of Chinese institutions have been arrested at foreign companies supplying parts for the C919, with the alleged objective of obtaining technical information that could be used to reverse engineer critical systems. The most prominent conviction came in November 2022, when Chinese intelligence officer Xu Yanjun was found guilty of espionage in the United States and sentenced to 20 years in prison. His case, along with a series of similar prosecutions, centered on companies including GE Aviation, Safran, and Honeywell, all key contributors to the C919 program. The striking resemblance of the C919 to the Airbus A320neo has also fueled further speculation, particularly given that Airbus operates a final assembly line for the A320neo in China. The consequences have been entirely predictable. Western companies are now deeply reluctant to share their most advanced technology with Chinese partners. And nowhere is this more visible than in the C919's engines. The aircraft is powered by the LEAP engine, produced by CFM International, a joint venture between General Electric and Francis Safran. While it shares a name with the engines powering the 737 MAX and the A320neo, it is not the same machine. According to a Forbes investigation, the variant supplied to Comac has been deliberately detuned, with internal architecture that owes far more to CFM's older CFM56 platform from the 1970s than to the cutting-edge variant flying on Western jets. And then there is geopolitics, perhaps the most volatile variable of all. The United States has long accused China of stealing advanced technology to bolster its military capabilities, an allegation Beijing has consistently denied. In January 2021, the Trump administration added Comac to a list of companies it claimed were supporting Chinese military apparatus, restricting the manufacturer's access to American technology and capital. While that restriction was eventually lifted, the damage to the broader relationship was not so easily undone. Since then, deepening geopolitical tensions and escalating trade conflicts between Washington and Beijing have cut both ways. On one side, Chinese authorities have dampened domestic airline orders for Boeing. Things got heated when Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo publicly accused the Chinese government in 2021 of blocking its own domestic carriers from purchasing tens of billions of dollars worth of American-manufactured aircraft. Moreover, there have been reports of Chinese authorities restricting the deliveries of new Boeing 737 MAX aircraft, citing technical objections that industry observers have widely regarded as pretextual. Washington has responded in kind. Last year, the United States Commerce Department suspended export licenses for key US-made aviation components, including the CFM LEAP engine, dealing a significant blow to COMAC's production schedule for both the C919 and the smaller C909. The message was unambiguous. China's flagship commercial aircraft program runs on Western components, and Washington retains the ability to turn that supply off. Faced with that reality, COMAC has now quietly abandoned its pursuit of FAA certification for the C919. The ambition to be a globally recognized, internationally certified airliner has been shelved, at least for now. So, where does that leave us? Based on what we've discussed so far, COMAC is unlikely to break the Boeing-Airbus duopoly in any meaningful global sense. Not this decade, and almost certainly not the next. But remember, it doesn't need to. Not globally anyway. If China succeeds in redirecting even a substantial portion of its own massive domestic demand toward COMAC, it will surely reshape the economics of the entire industry. The question is no longer whether COMAC is a serious contender, it already is. The question is how long the West can hold the line.